Mineral fertilizer has saved more lives than any other invention that mankind has created. The story of Yara is incredible. It's about the fusion of the most basic elements that nature has given us. We use nitrogen from the air, salts from ancient seas and oceans, and phosphate rock from the ground. These are the natural raw materials that make up Yara's mineral fertilizer. Yara was born in 1905. Through its entire history, Yara has been an innovative and technology-driven company. And what we have is an incredibly knowledgeable workforce. There are people who are expert in how to source materials, how to move and manage materials. And we have people in the production plants who know all of the very technical engineering and chemical background to the products that we produce. We have incredibly talented people advising farmers on exactly how to apply fertilizer at the right time, in the right place, and in the right conditions. Yara's business is all about the farmer. Farmers need to ensure that the soil is healthy, that it has the right nutrients in it, and that it's sustainable. And it matters because by 2050, the world will have 9 billion people. We need 60% more food, using less land with greater yield, but we cannot produce more emissions. Everybody in Yara has a role to play when it comes to achieving our mission to responsibly feed the world and protect the planet. The only way we can do that is if we work together. The problems that the world is facing are bigger than just one company, and they're bigger than just one country. We have to reach across boundaries to solve these things. We've done that throughout our history, and today is no exception. It's in that shared success that we define our future. For Yara, it's about bringing people together, feeding the world, and looking after the planet.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Yara Top Potato 2022 Virtual Summit. My name is Lucas Meyer, and I'm the Regional Sales Manager for Ontario, and I will be one of your hosts for today.
Welcome. My name is Emmeline Long, and I'm the other host for today's event. I'm the Crop Manager for Yara Eastern Canada, but I actually live in Western New York.
Both Emma and I will be covering north and south of the border today, but we also wanted to make sure that we had both English and French speaking looked after as well. So Jerome is going to be joining us today, not only for his good looks, but his French-speaking abilities.
So hello everyone, bonjour et bienvenue. I'm very excited to be with you both to help introduce our annual Top Potato meeting. So just like Lucas said, my name is Jerome Blouin, and I'm the Regional Sales Manager for Quebec. So for the French speaker, we have translated all the presentation today in French, so we won't be having a live translation like we did last year. Donc, bonjour à tous, je suis très content d'être avec vous aujourd'hui pour présenter l'événement Top Potato. Donc, mon nom est Jérôme Blouin, je suis directeur des ventes chez Yara pour le Québec. Donc, pour les francophones qui sont présents aujourd'hui, nous avons traduit toutes les présentations en français, donc il n'y aura pas de traduction simultanée cette année.
Today's event will be interactive, and you'll see on your screen there's a control panel with several buttons that you can push on, and it'll bring up that corresponding window.
Some of the things you can do throughout the presentation are ask a question in the Q&A field at any point. You can download resources that we've placed there using this icon. That includes product descriptions and any materials that will go along with today's presentations. And you can view contact information for everyone who appears on screen today.
Donc, l'événement aujourd'hui est sur une plateforme interactive. Donc, sur votre écran, dans le bas, vous verrez plusieurs boutons. En cliquant sur ceux-ci, vous pourrez ouvrir les fenêtres correspondantes. Donc, parmi ceux-ci, il y a ceux-là que Lucas est en train de montrer. Donc, vous pouvez soumettre une question dans le champ de Q&A à tout moment et ensuite télécharger tous les documents associés à chacune des présentations. Et finalement, vous pouvez aussi voir les informations pour contacter chacune des personnes qui est présente aujourd'hui.
You can also rearrange the boxes on the screen and minimize the ones that you don't want to see using this square in the top right-hand corner. We also will have a few audience polls for everyone today that will pop up throughout the presentation. We encourage you to participate and share your opinions.
Donc, vous pouvez également utiliser les boutons dans les coins supérieurs droits de chaque fenêtre pour les déplacer ou les rapetisser ou les agrandir. Et finalement, nous avons des sondages qui apparaîtront sur la plateforme au courant de la journée. Donc, évidemment, nous vous encourageons à participer.
It's hard to believe that it's been a year since our first virtual Top Potato meeting, and I know that the whole group was really hoping we could all be in person and have this meeting. But however, on the upside, having virtual meeting gives us the ability to provide top knowledge and key speakers all in one convenient spot, and we don't have to leave the office or the farm.
You know, Jerome and I don't even know what it's like to be at an in-person Top Potato event. We both joined Yara in 2021, but we're really happy to be here hosting today.
As well, joining us in the background is our growing Eastern Canada team. So we've got Sean McKeever, who's our regional sales manager for the Maritimes, Nick Tisdale, our sales agronomist for the Maritimes as well, Nodi Seville, who's our sales agronomist in Quebec, as well as Taylor Jeffrey, our sales agronomist in Ontario. And last and never forgotten is Mr. McMillan, our Yarvita senior Yarvita specialist for Eastern Canada.
And we're going to stay available throughout the presentation to answer questions in that Q&A field. So please, at any point, feel free to ask a question. Donc, nous resterons disponibles tout au long des présentations pour répondre à toutes vos questions émises dans le champ de Q&A, le champ de questions et réponses. Alors, n'hésitez pas de le faire à tout moment.
We're excited this year to offer you, I would say, maybe a little bit of a carrot to keep you around for the virtual meeting. And what that will be is an opportunity to enter you into a prize, or in a draw, I should say, for a Traeger grill. So at the end of the meeting, we're going to take everyone who's still in attendance, and a couple days after the meeting, we'll announce the winner. So good luck.
Donc, cette année, nous sommes très heureux d'avoir la possibilité de faire tirer un prix à tous ceux qui seront en mesure de rester jusqu'à la fin. Donc, les participants seront ainsi automatiquement éligibles pour gagner un grill de marque Traeger. Et le gagnant sera annoncé peu de temps après l'événement.
Well, let's get started with today's speakers. Our first speaker today is Marcus Broughton, joining us from Yara's market development team. Marcus really has a passion for agronomy, particularly crop nutrition, and he's going to be speaking to us today about the importance of micronutrients in potato production.
Donc, notre premier présentateur aujourd'hui, c'est Marcus, qui lui est dans l'équipe de développement des marchés chez Yara. Il va nous parler aujourd'hui de l'importance des micronutriments dans la production de la pomme de terre.
And go ahead, Marcus.
Hello, my name is Marcus Broughton. I'm a Market Development Manager for Yara North America. My current role, I'm focused on kind of the confluence of technology and agronomy and seeking to develop digital tools that allow us to deliver agronomic solutions in a new and innovative way. That said, my first passion is and always has been crop nutrition, so it's definitely a privilege today to visit with you on that particular topic. And I'm going to start this in maybe a slightly different place. I want to start with this notion of delivering complete nutrition without complexity. And by no means am I suggesting that crop nutrition, the role of nutrients, how crops access nutrients, crop need for specific nutrients, I'm not suggesting that is not complex. It is complex. It's highly nuanced and highly site-specific. However, I think the opportunity for us as we move forward is to figure out ways in which we can deliver crop nutrition in a way that is simple, right? Not simplistic, but simple. In a way that understands and acknowledges the inherent complexity, the inherent nuance in delivering crop nutrition, and seeks to deliver it in a way that recognizes that we have a need for operational efficiency on farm, that we have a need to ensure that we're choosing products that have a high degree of agronomic integrity, and that we're choosing products and practices that ultimately drive grower profitability. And I think we've got a product that I'm going to speak to kind of at the end of this that kind of brings all that together, that allows us to deliver some specific nutrients in an innovative way and address specific nutrient needs within that crop. So that's kind of where I want to go today. But I do want to spend a little bit of time and unpack this notion of complete nutrition. And, really what we're doing in agriculture is fairly straightforward, right? It's fairly straightforward. At the end of the day, we need to build an effective root system under the crops that we're growing, right? We need to build that root system, build the shoots that ultimately support the leaves, right? The leaves are the site of photosynthesis. So the canopy, a robust, green, healthy canopy is critically important for us because that becomes the site of photosynthesis. And then ultimately we want to be able to take those products of photosynthesis, the starches that are produced as a result of the photosynthetic process, and we want to store those in the tuber, right? So to steal kind of some language of a colleague of mine, we're talking about the potato as a living starch factory, right? And we need to facilitate the production and storage of those starches. And of course, in order to do that, there are some certain raw materials that we need to make sure are available to that crop. And in crop nutrition, we refer to these as elements or nutrients, right? And when we talk about crop nutrition, generally speaking, folks will acknowledge the fact that there's 16, arguably 17 essential nutrients. And I've got 12 of them on the screen here now. The ones that are missing are the 3 that we source from the environment, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Of course, we source those in the form of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water, H2O, right? And the other 2 that I don't have on here are chloride and nickel. And to some degree, we don't focus, though, right or wrong, we don't focus on those nutrients in potato as much. But the rest of these here are critically essential for our crops to undergo the natural life cycle of building roots, building shoots, building leaves, and storing starch. They have to be there, right? They have to be there. We might argue or we might question the need to apply every single one of these nutrients. In other words, maybe I don't need to go out and apply iron, or I don't need to go out and apply molybdenum on my particular crop. But those nutrients must be supplied, right? They have to be there in order for that crop to undergo its normal life cycle. They're either going to source it from the soil, or they're not going to get it. And if you happen to be dealing with a soil that is deficient in those, you very well could have a deficiency and a consequent result of a reduction in productivity. So they must be there. They're required for this crop to undergo its natural life processes, right? Additionally, we know that whether you're applying these nutrients or not, your crops are removing these nutrients, right? So there's a certain amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, zinc, molybdenum, manganese that our crops are removing on an annual basis from every acre that we're producing these crops. And if we're not supplying those nutrients, over time we will draw down that soil reserve. And again, there could be a risk of deficiency. So ultimately, when we're thinking about delivering complete nutrition, we need to be thinking about all of these nutrients. These nutrients provide or perform vital and essential roles within that crop's life. However, for the purposes of the day and limited time that we've got, I'm going to focus on just a handful of them. And the nutrients I'm going to focus on are magnesium, copper, manganese, and zinc. And I'm doing that for a specific purpose. One is to kind of make the case for a product, again, that I think fills this niche of delivering complete nutrition without complexity. But I also think there's real agronomic reasons why it makes sense for us to focus on these nutrients. And we'll just walk through these nutrients, nutrient by nutrient, talk a little bit about their roles, and why I think it makes sense for us to position these nutrients foliarly, and then wrap up with an introduction of that particular product. So first and foremost, magnesium. Magnesium. What does magnesium do in the crop? Of course, most times what we're going to focus on when it comes to magnesium is the role that it plays in photosynthesis. Again, we're talking about the potato as a living starch factory. In order for us to build those starches, we have to have photosynthesis taking place. And magnesium is important in that process because it provides a structural role. It is actually the central element, if you will, in the chlorophyll molecule, right? So you need to have magnesium in order to have chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is the site of photosynthesis. And oftentimes maybe this gets maybe undue focus. Probably about 20% of the magnesium in a crop is associated with structure. The rest of that is actually functional. Within the crop itself. So it plays a role in the production of sugars and proteins and the transportation of those sugars and proteins within the plant, specifically from the leaves to the tuber, and consequently has a significant impact on tuber quality, impacting starch content, protein concentration, and even the taste of the cooked potato is influenced by this particular nutrient. If we run into situations where we have deficiency with magnesium, those deficiencies are going to take on a very characteristic look. Oftentimes you're going to see some yellowing, some browning, some interveinal chlorosis, we tend to refer to it as. In extreme situations, that potato will actually die. You can have significant stunting. We can see a reduction in yield to the tune of 15%. And there's a distinct impact on how that tuber is going to store when we're moving it around in that, the tendency for it to bruise, and the quality of the skin itself is all influenced by this particular nutrient. So definitely one that we don't want to end up in a situation where we're actually deficient. Copper is a nutrient that oftentimes gets overlooked in potato nutrition. In fact, you can find publications where there's really minimal reference made to the need for copper in potatoes. But we have to remember that copper is an essential nutrient and is required for all plants to undergo natural life processes. And of course, this plays a number of roles. Again, it plays a role in photosynthesis and respiration, kind of as a catalyst within those reactions. But probably for the purposes of this conversation, the role that this nutrient plays that's going to be most important are the roles around the structural integrity of the plant, specifically the vascular tissue. So having good movement of water and nutrients within the plant. Copper influences that, and it also influences the quality of the skin set in the potato. So we want to make sure that we've got adequate copper levels in our crop programs to facilitate that. Furthermore, copper plays an important role as we're making this transition from vegetative to reproductive growth in crops. So pollen formation, viability, and fertilization, copper plays an important role there. Of course, not as important in every crop, but again, just to drive home this point of the universality for the need of this particular nutrient is quite strong. Copper is also involved in carbohydrate and protein metabolism as well. So, this is, again, an essential nutrient that must be in place in order for that crop to undergo natural life processes. Manganese, again, probably one that you've likely heard of, becomes critically important when we're talking about photosynthesis. This is a nutrient that not only plays a role in structurally in the chlorophyll molecule, but is also responsible for the splitting of hydrogen and oxygen in photosynthesis itself. So it plays an active role in that particular process. Becomes an important component in protein synthesis, and sometimes we don't maybe pay as much attention to protein production in crops other than like a cereal crop or something like that, where there's actually a protein scale associated with it. But protein production is required. Again, it's one of these life processes that's required by all crops, and manganese plays an important role within that. Additionally, and probably a role that's going to become more and more important as we look down the road, is the role that manganese plays in influencing nitrogen use efficiency, right? The more efficient our crops become, the better off we are, and manganese plays a role in that. Zinc, of course, a nutrient that probably has, as a micronutrient, that probably has more focus on it than a lot. But again, zinc plays critical roles in the development and regulation of crop growth. So this is one that if we have inadequate amounts, we'll actually see stunting. We often talk about the role that zinc plays in influencing leaf area index. Again, so if we think about the potato as a living starch factory, the bigger our leaves, the more photosynthesis is going to take place, and zinc is a nutrient that influences that. Like other micronutrients, zinc plays a role in the production of protein and carbohydrates and how they're metabolized, utilized within the crop. So that's another role that it plays. And it also plays a role in mitigating of stress, crop stress, biological and abiotic stresses, and disease tolerance, and specifically in potato, diseases that are caused by the Rhizoctonia class or species of pathogens. So that would be powdery scab in potato, and then root rot in cereals. So pretty important role that those nutrients play. I want to shift gears just a little bit here from the roles of the nutrient to the need for proactive crop nutrition delivered foliarly. And I think sometimes we get into this mode of feeling that, well, the primary purpose of the root is to take up nutrients, so what are we worried about foliar nutrition for? And I want to make the case that when we're thinking about a complete and comprehensive crop nutrition program, that foliar nutrition should be one of the things that we're cognizant of, or that we're thinking about, we're considering. And I think the potato industry in general has done an excellent job in this particular space. Probably have more adoption of foliar as a practice, foliar nutrition as a practice, than we do in other crop, in any other crop. And so that's a very, very strong positive. But just to kind of further make the case for the need for foliar nutrition, I think it's important to recognize that when we're looking at a crop growing in any given year, that there is going to be a significant likelihood that crop is going to come into contact or become deficient in nutrients over the course of that growing season. And this is because of a number of reasons. I'm going to kind of unpack these one by one. over the next series of animations here. And the first one has to do with just baseline fertility status, right? And we recognize the fact from years and years of soil testing that we have pockets of deficiency, and these pockets of deficiencies express themselves or manifest themselves regionally, and they can manifest themselves at the field and subfield level as well. And it's important for us to recognize that, acknowledge that, that in some geographies, copper, for example, is a nutrient of concern, that zinc is a nutrient of concern. And whether they're categorically deficient or just maybe marginally deficient, really doesn't matter. From a crop's perspective, there is a chance that crop is going to not have adequate levels of that particular nutrient when it needs them because of the baseline fertility status. So for sure, starting with a good solid soil test is an excellent place to start. From there, I think we can talk to concepts around fertility placement. Where are we placing those nutrients, and does the crop have a chance of coming into contact with those particular nutrients? And probably the place where this has been most pronounced is in the area of soil-applied micronutrient nutrition. The application of granular micronutrients, we know, is not as effective, not as efficient as strategies where we're seeking to maximize the number of feeding sites for that micronutrient. In fact, this is really the place where Yara Proco kind of fits, right? Where we're able to increase the number of feeding sites, we're leveraging the granular fertility program that's being used and increasing the likelihood of the crop coming into those particular nutrients. But there's always going to be an inherent limitation associated with nutrient availability as a function of soil placement, fertilizer placement. And we just need to recognize that at the outset. Soil pH, a huge factor, right? Soil pH, I tend to talk about soil pH as the soil attribute that rocks the nutrient availability world. Knowing where you're at from a pH perspective, recognizing the fact that pH is going to vary across the field becomes an important consideration, and is likely going to be one of the things that contributes to the likelihood of a nutrient deficiency. Copper, for instance, higher pH, higher organic matter, lighter textured soil, and you reduce the likelihood, or you reduce the availability of that particular nutrient. So it's something that we want to be cognizant of when we're anticipating or planning for delivering nutrients over the course of a particular growing season. This next one here, nutrient interaction within the soil, is inherently complex. And we don't have time to unpack this completely, but suffices to say that the way we're managing nutrients, both from an application perspective and the nutrient levels inherent in the soil, have an impact on one another. And Mulder's chart here illustrates the interactions, the deleterious interactions, the antagonistic interactions from a nutrient by nutrient basis. And so if we're applying too much nitrogen, for example, that's going to potentially impact the availability of copper. If we're applying too much phosphorus, that could impact the availability of zinc. Calcium and boron, these two nutrients interact together as well. And so we need to make sure that not only are we cognizant of these levels in the soil, but we're cognizant of how those nutrients potentially interact and influence the availability of one another within the soil as well. And that in and of itself could be a reason why we would want to consider a foliar nutrition. We also need to recognize the fact that nutrients have limited nutrient mobility in the soil. And that influences the likelihood of that crop being able to take up those nutrients, right? And so this kind of goes back to the fertilizer placement notion again here as well. But we just need to remember that there's a range at which we have nutrient availability in the soil, and that's going to influence the plant's availability to access that nutrient. So it's not enough just to apply that nutrient, right? The nutrient has to be taken up by that crop, and sometimes based on a whole host of factors, it's compromised, right? The soil pH, the mobility, all these things interacting together and resulting in that crop actually not getting that nutrient. So foliar nutrition can help us to overcome that. Cooler soil temperatures, probably don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but just suffice to say that we want to make sure that we're not limiting our crop because it just can't access the nutrients because our soils haven't warmed up, right? We know that nutrient availability is in part a function of soil temperature. But so too is the way that crop wants to explore soils. It's a function of soil temperature as well. So just something to be aware of. Environmental stress in general, right? It's too hot, it's too cold, we got frost, we got too much water, we don't have enough water. All of these things together influence that crop's ability to access nutrient in different ways, right? And so foliar nutrition could be a way for us to overcome that environmental stress, right? And deliver that nutrient in such a way. It's a little bit I don't know if ironic is the right word here, but part of a crop's ability to deal with environmental stress or stress in general is through good balanced nutrition. But if that crop can't access the nutrition because of the environmental stress, we have to figure out how we overcome that barrier, right? And that very well could be through the use of a strategically, proactively delivered foliar nutrient. And this last one, I think, is probably one of the more important ones, especially as we start looking at higher yield and looking to achieve greater levels of productivity. And this is the concept of nutrient demand exceeding the soil's ability to supply that nutrient. It may not be over the entire growth cycle of that crop, but maybe it's just at key periods, right? So, we've got a critical growth stage where there's a requirement for copper, for example, or for manganese, for example, and the soil can't actually deliver that. It's not like it's categorically deficient, right? It just doesn't have enough of what it needs at that particular growth stage. So plugging in of these foliar products at specific times very well can help us to overcome those challenges. So I think that's something that we really want to consider. So if we come back again to this notion of complete nutrition without complexity, that our primary role is to deliver crop nutrition in such a way that we're building roots, we're building shoots, we're building leaves, and we're able to move those products of photosynthesis around in the crop. How do we go about doing that? And I think one of the ways for us to do that proactively is through the use of Yara Magtrac CMZ. And what I love about this product is that it really can be kind of our first step in foliar nutrition, recognizing the fact that where we're growing these potatoes, we're likely to come into contact with nutrient need associated with these handful of nutrients. And if we're plugging these in, maybe on our first pass, maybe with fungicide, whatever, that we're going to be able to strategically and almost surgically deliver these nutrients at a critical growth stage to go overcome the potential of deficiency with these particular nutrients. And I'll let the commercial teams talk specifically to rates and timings and all that. But what I love about this product is that we've got kind of agronomic integrity built into it, right? We're looking at that crop and we're asking ourselves, well, what nutrients are we most likely to need at this particular time? Right? We're bundling those together. We're looking after the inherent synergy between some of these nutrients and allowing growers to overcome or proactively prevent the deficiency associated with these nutrients. Now, this doesn't totally replace your fertility program, but it's an excellent supplement to your fertility program.
Thank you so much, Marcus. This presentation makes me really excited to see another year of Magtrac CMZ performance in the field.
Yeah, I'd agree, Emma. I mean, it's a great product, and Marcus provided great information about the importance of those individual micronutrients, but also the importance of supplying them together.
It's time for our first poll question today. Now that we've learned about the importance of micronutrients, as well as more about our new Yara Magtrac CMZ product, how often do you plan to apply a foliar fertilizer to your potato crop in 2022? Every pass with the sprayer, only when you see an issue, or never, there's already enough in your tank?
While Magtrac CMZ is a new product for us this year, it's formulated specifically for Eastern Canada based off of results that we see from deficiencies in tissue samples and soil samples. We're really excited to look at what it's going to do for us here in the 2022 season.
We foresee it being most beneficial early on in the season because, as Marcus said, we want to anticipate deficiencies later on in the season. If this is a product that interests you, we encourage you to reach out to your local Yara rep.
It's great to see the responses coming in here. It looks like a lot of the audience actually selected every pass with, is including some sort of foliar with every pass in the sprayer. So I think that's great. We want to leverage that application throughout the field. So moving on here, our next speaker is Brian Kenyon. So Brian Kenyon is our Vice President for Innovation and Sustainable Solutions for North America. Brian's actually going to be speaking to us on the carbon footprint in production of food, and as well as what that's going to look like for us here in the future for our operations.
Donc, la prochaine présentation sera faite par Brian, qui est vice-président pour l'innovation et les solutions de développement durable chez Yara dans l'Amérique du Nord. Il va nous parler aujourd'hui de l'empreinte carbone dans la production alimentaire et comment ça peut nous affecter dans le futur.
Before we get started with Brian's presentation, we have another poll question for everyone. How much do you think carbon sequestration and carbon footprint of crops will impact your operation over the next 5 years? Do you think it won't impact it at all? It might impact it a little, or it will impact a lot?
There's so many phrases involving carbon being used right now, you know, carbon sequestration, carbon footprint, decarbonization, carbon credits. You know, there is probably a lot of confusion around these terms and what it really means for agriculture and food production. I really hope that Brian's presentation helps clear up some of those questions around carbon and really what it means for us in the future on producing potatoes.
Thank you to everyone who answered. It's really interesting to see everyone's take on the role of carbon in their operations. With that, I will hand it over to Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Kenyon with Yara. I'm the Vice President of Innovation and Sustainable Solutions. And today I'm going to be talking about carbon footprints and decarbonizing the food chain. We know that the world's population is going to grow to 9.8 billion people by 2050, and we know that this is going to require a 50% increase in food production on that same area of land. Additionally, greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced by 90 to 100% to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate pledge. None of this is going to be easy, but if we're going to have a healthy planet, we need to act now. Of the supply chains that represent greater than 50% of global emissions, the food chain contributes 25% of global emissions. And of that total, agriculture, forestry, and land use change is responsible for 20% of the emissions. So any small changes in agriculture will have a very significant impact on total emissions globally. The big shift happening today is the direct result of consumers demanding that all companies, including food companies, alter how they produce their finished products to reduce their impact on the environment. So no matter whether we believe in climate change or the reasons for it, the consumers of the food you produce want change and they want it now. And on the impact and influence, add on the impact and influence of social media, activist shareholders who are also demanding change, and the sheer amount of money being spent and invested in companies with strong environmental, social, and governance goals, and you'll quickly see that change is inevitable. According to research by Forbes, 60% of consumers buy products and services from companies that are socially and or environmentally responsible. Interest in conscious purchasing of food has grown by 551% among Gen Z consumers, according to Spoonshot. It's interesting that 52% of the world's population is less than 30 years old. This is a generation that is the consumer of tomorrow, and they want change. This is driving an increase in potential value capture on farm, and regardless of your beliefs, this will create real opportunities. Activist shareholder pressure and consumer demand focused on sustainability and climate is something that all companies are reacting to. There will also be a need to decarbonize as carbon costs increase. For example, the Canadian government has a carbon price target of $170 a ton by 2030 in a push to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels. There are now over 1,000 companies that have declared their decarbonization targets, and the number that have declared net zero targets have nearly doubled from 2019 to 2020, and I'm quite confident that it's grown even more in 2021. As a result, companies are working to reduce internal emissions and finding ways to remove all of the rest. This creates demand for more solutions that helps reduce emissions globally. Many companies, as I mentioned earlier, have released their carbon pledges. Sometimes you see pledges for carbon neutrality and other times net zero. The difference between the two is that carbon neutral means purchasing carbon reduction credits equivalent to emissions released without the need for emissions reductions to have taken place at all. Net zero reduction means reducing emissions in line with latest climate science and then balancing that remaining residual emissions through carbon removal credits, such as the purchase of biogas or investing in carbon capture and storage systems. So what's happening now? Well, there's a pile of investment, up to $30 trillion being invested in ESG goals, which means that there's going to be a lot more risk taken to transform how goods and services are produced today. There are no easy answers, but companies are going to have to figure out how to do this. And you can expect that we're going to see more regulation, more government intervention, and definitely political pressure, as we see today, for change to happen. We need to keep educating and informing our farmers so that they can capture the opportunities for sustainability income at the farm gate. So let's talk a little bit about carbon footprints. So when a company produces a goods or services, they emit carbon. And there's basically three types of emissions that occur. Scope 1 emissions are emissions that happen as a direct result of producing something at your facility. Scope 2 emissions are anything to do with purchased energy inputs like electricity, and if that electricity emits carbon, then you account for that in your Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 has two types of emissions. Upstream emissions are all the emissions that are the result of products that are produced and sold to the companies that make products. And then you have your downstream emissions, Scope 3, which is everything after the plant gate. So it's transportation, distribution, and basically the final use of the product and any emissions that happen along the way. So for example, Yara's total 2020 corporate greenhouse gas footprint was 70 million tons of CO2. 17 of that was Scope 1 in the direct production of our products through the burning of natural gas to make ammonia and then all the nitrogen products that come from that. Our Scope 2 emissions through the purchase of electricity was 1 million tons of carbon. We had another 11 million tons of CO2 in our imported ammonia as an example of products that come in and to service our production plants. And then on the downstream side, our Scope 3 downstream emissions are calculated to be around 42 million tons of CO2, so for a total of 70 million tons globally for our organization. Not all fertilizer companies produce the same fertilizer the same way. The investments made by Yara since 2005 have reduced our product carbon footprint of the fertilizers we make by 45% through 2019. Future planned reductions and the introductions of green ammonia, for example, made with renewable energy, is expected to reduce our footprint a further 30% by 2030. These investments will pay back in the future as the need for low carbon footprint food becomes the norm. Every step along the food chain creates a carbon footprint, so the company you purchase goods from matters as it impacts your environmental footprint. Anything that you can do, such as using a lower carbon footprint fertilizer, will ultimately reduce the carbon produced in the food that we consume. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about carbon markets, so I'll try to explain a bit about how they work. And today I'm going to talk about the voluntary carbon markets. So companies, after they've done everything that they can to reduce their carbon emissions, can voluntarily purchase carbon offsets to meet their emission reduction targets. There's no legal regulation that requires companies to do that. However, all of the marketplaces are fully regulated by registries such as CARE, Vera, and Gold Standard. They create the rules on how to generate carbon credits by reducing emissions or storing carbon in the soil. And currently, all ag credits are sold on the voluntary market. What are carbon credits, also known as offsets, also known as removals? Well, one carbon credit is 1 ton of avoided or sequestered greenhouse gas emissions issued by a registry and traded among private parties. And it's always referred to as CO2 equivalent. So all the conversions for, say, N2O gas, which is 288 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2, it is all converted into CO2 equivalents. So that's corrected for. So carbon credits are generated by introducing carbon smart farming practices that can sequester additional soil carbon as compared to what is common practice today. So for example, cover crops or pasture management, so rotational grazing, things like that, that can add carbon to the soil, takes it out of the atmosphere and puts it in the soil. Those are considered carbon sequestration practices. They can also be any practice that reduces greenhouse gas emissions from your farming operations. So, for example, the use of enhanced efficiency fertilizers or using precision ag to find the right rate on the field, or splitting application is an example of how you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to carbon credit measurement, all practice changes are verified and validated by third parties. So they're kind of like auditors. They make sure that what you said you were doing is actually carried out. Farmers have to follow the methodologies as written by the registries. You can't cut corners. You can't take shortcuts. You have to follow the methodologies. At the start of the practice change, when you introduce it, baseline measurements, usually when it comes to soil sequestration of carbon, you take soil samples to determine what was your baseline in the soil, so what was your starting point. And then as the accumulation of soil organic carbon goes on over time, you measure it in intervals, and that's what is recorded, and that's what you get paid for. So Yara last year introduced and set up the Agoro Carbon Alliance, and it's really an alliance between farmers, agronomists, and business partners that believe that we can bring sustainability income to the farm and help introduce practice changes that are going to make a difference to soil health. We introduced this, and we've started this project in our alliance in the United States. We're expanding it now to Brazil, Europe, and India. We don't have it yet in Canada, but we hope that this year we'll be able to start introducing the Carbon Alliance here in Canada and allow the Canadian farmers to participate. The practice changes that we've introduced so far is no-till, cover crop, and pasture management as practice changes that store atmospheric carbon in the soil. Nitrogen management is the changing of one or all of the 4 R's, such as rate, time, place, or product, to optimize end use and reduce emissions. We're going to add more practices in the future, and if you've already implemented some of them already, hopefully we'll have some new ones available in the next 2 to 3 years that'll allow you to generate sustainability income at the farm gate. Agoro will offer incentives to growers to introduce a practice change on their farm. Once the change is implemented, a verifying and validating body will confirm that it has been implemented properly. The registry, such as Vera, will then issue a verified emission reduction certificate for the tons of carbon sequestered. This certificate is then sold to a buyer who wishes to offset their emissions from their own operations. So in summary, we think this is a tremendous opportunity for agriculture. We're seeing really that food and ag companies are shifting from a short-term, low-cost production focus that has really been volume-driven to one that is long-term, high-quality food system that's designed to restore soil health and reduce emissions. And I think that's just a tremendous thing for agriculture. And we think that agriculture is obviously part of the solution. There's many, many options for farmers and ranchers. And like I said earlier, if practice change today is something that you've already done, There's more coming, so be sure to keep checking in and making sure that you get to participate. And hopefully we can find practices that will make sense on your farm. It's increasingly more opportunities and more ways to connect the consumer demand and that whole climate investment back to the farm. So I think that's, if we can get projects like this going, I think it's going to be just a tremendous opportunity. We also know that consumers want change. The shareholders are holding companies accountable, and investment capital is massive. And let's face it, when you spend $30 trillion, which is what it's estimated to be by 2030, you know that change is going to happen through innovation and breakthroughs that don't exist today. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to see some important things coming in the future. And being an early mover will help define the new practices and products that will shape the future food system. So at Yara, we're helping to make sure that agriculture has a role to play, not only in how we produce food sustainably, but also in how it can contribute to a healthier planet. So thank you for your time today. I hope that I was able to provide some useful insight into why carbon footprints of products matter and how this push for decarbonization can benefit you and help generate healthier soils for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I think it's fair to say that I've learned a fair bit more on that topic. I mean, he mentioned some really interesting points, and one thing that I picked up was I never really considered the average age of the consumer and really what they want and how they're going to dictate how our food's produced. And one of that obviously being carbon reduction. So I think that's going to be obviously a really large part going forward in the future. I know probably prior to Brian's speak that I would have answered will impact a little bit, but definitely going to change my answer to will impact a lot after hearing Brian talk.
I definitely agree. It's going to be really interesting to see how this carbon conversation plays out in the very near future.
Well, that's great. Well, our next presenter is Greg Patterson. Greg Patterson is from A&L Labs here in London, Ontario. I'm sure he's probably is a very familiar face to many of us here in Eastern Canada. And he's going to be taking some time to present to us on the application of boron and potassium in our potato crop.
So, prochaine présentation sera faite aujourd'hui par Greg Patterson, qui est des laboratoires AEL en Ontario. Donc, c'est peut-être quelqu'un dont le visage vous est familier. Il va nous parler aujourd'hui de l'impact plus particulier du bore et de la potasse dans la production de la pomme de terre.
And we're ready for you, Greg.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this brief presentation on boron and potassium in agriculture. Just want to review with everybody on what we're doing in field for quality and yield in potato, and particularly focused on the requirements for potash and boron as it relates to quality and yield in potato. We know from a lot of trials we've done over the years with our own yield clubs and other work done around the world that potassium has a big influence on potatoes. Potatoes are a large consumer of potassium, and without decent potassium levels in production, we just don't get the yields we're looking for. This is a simple trial from one of our trials back in the days when we did potassium research in field and PEI. And this is just different rates of potassium put on potatoes and the type of response we got to both specific gravity and yield. And a lot of concerns were that too much potassium would lower specific gravity and really doesn't have any influence on specific gravity unless you don't balance things like magnesium off with it. And I'll show you that in these results here. But you can see how our pay weight has increased with it going from no potassium to 200, then 300 pounds per acre. And then 500 pounds, we still had a response, but not as much a response as we should have had because our magnesiums were too low. And that also was reflected in a slight drop in specific gravity as well. So a lot of the reactions between different nutrients in potato production are important to pay attention to. But right now we're going to focus on particularly boron and potassium and the antagonism and synergism between these two elements in production of any crop. So when we look at these two elements, as we increase our percent saturation of potassium by increased applications of potassium, our boron absorption to the potassium and clay actually increases, so it reduces the availability to boron in plants. As we increase the boron levels or availability to potatoes, we stop the efflux of potassium from potato tissue, maintaining higher potassium concentration in the tissue and hence better yields and outcome. Oftentimes we refer to boron and pH relationships, and yes, there's a relationship to availability of boron in crops to soil pH, but this is also very much attributed to the fact that most higher pH soils are higher in clay content, and from the research I'm going to share with you here, we can see that there's a real affinity of boron to clay, and the higher the clay content, the higher the absorption of boron to the soil and the lower the availability to plant production. Again, just some more research work and data here on as the pH goes up, the higher absorption of boron to soils and the lower the availability. But the reality here is that the biggest factor in boron availability is this true affinity that boron has to clay, and the higher the clay content or the higher the CEC of the soil, the more the absorption of boron to the clay and the lower the availability of the crop, which means in general terms we need higher boron levels in the soil as our CEC goes up. And from our own research, it looks something like this. When you're in soil, sandier soil types with CECs down under 10, 1 to 1.5 ppm of boron is usually optimum for boron availability. That means it will be released from the soil, but for potato productions, you're still going to have to augment your program with a decent boron program, and we'll talk to that here in a few minutes. But as your CECs get up to 18 to 20, your optimum level needs to be closer to 2 to 2.5 ppm just to make sure that there is some available boron coming from the soil. So we kind of review that. When we look at increasing soil potassium levels, as we increase soil potassium levels, we reduce the availability of boron. So in production agriculture with potatoes, with the additional potassium we're applying for yield, we're suppressing boron availability. So this antagonism between these two is real. So keeping that in mind in production agriculture, the more we push for yields of potassium, the more we have to focus on a boron program, both ground application and foliar, to make up the difference. So kind of in summary here, as we increase boron availability to the crop, either by foliar application or soil application, we increase potassium retention in the tissue or reduce the efflux of the potassium. And as we reduce boron availability, we actually decrease the concentration of potassium in the plant tissue itself. So yes, increasing calcium and pH has an impact in decreasing the boron availability, but as you can see here, it's more of CEC or clay content factor that's influencing this boron availability to this crop. So in summary, we summarize the soil parameters influencing boron availability to plants from soil. CEC is number 1, organic matter close behind that, pH being a factor. Moisture is always an issue because boron is taken up by the plant through respiration, and when there's very little moisture, boron is just not moving up the plant. So it's an environmental issue that is always a problem. Then temperature, and as I said before, this increasing potassium saturation in soils has a real impact on boron availability. So when we're making recommendations, we do recognize the need for boron application, both foliar and soil applied, and we do have these different levels in soils, going from sands up to heavier clays where we target the optimum level. And it's important in production agriculture because it's an important part of a potato program for many things that we're going to talk about here. Our trials in Manitoba, this is an area where our soils are quite a bit heavier than other potato producing areas that we deal with. Average CEC of these soils is a sandy clay loam running about 16 to 20. This particular field we worked in, and many of the fields around it, has a boron level of about 0.8 ppm, which is low for this soil, and always having a difficulty getting boron into plants no matter what we did. The average application was a pound of boron on the ground before we're planting, and it just didn't seem to move the boron levels whatsoever in our tissues. Coming back with foliar applications, again, very conservatively at a quarter pound, just not getting it done with these rates. So our trial started out looking at up to 4 pounds of actual boron. And this particular trial saw the best response was right around 3 pounds of actual boron applied on top of our foliar program. So looking at 1 pound, again, the foliars weren't touching it. Augmenting this 1 pound program on the ground with foliars didn't have any impact on boron levels in tissues. Pretty much the same thing with 2 pounds, but you can see a little bit of yield response here. 3 pounds, tremendous response, and that seemed to be the magic ticket, particularly going in here with a little bit of late season boron to finish this crop. And then comparing that to 4 pounds, really no significant difference in 4 pounds. Actually, we can see a little bit of size differentiation here that had an impact on overall quality. So the magic number seems to be, in this particular soil type, around 3 pounds of actual boron on the ground before we start planting this crop, or a combination of broadcast and in the row, and following up with a good boron program based on tissue analysis and maintaining adequate levels. So when we look at the physiology in the plant and we talk about potassium efflux without and with boron, you can see here where we have adequate supply of boron, we have adequate tissue levels of potassium in the tissue. And as we increase boron or decrease boron concentrations in tissue, we see also a decrease in potassium levels, or a greater efflux of potassium from tissue. So when we look at the overall physiology, that's something we have to consider. As boron in substrate increases, it reduces the efflux of potassium, therefore increasing or maintaining potassium levels in our petioles. To a point, once we get to a toxic level, we start seeing it go the other way, and again we get a stronger efflux of potassium and lower levels in tissue. So other trials have also supported this. We're looking at this more even in soil health and microbial activity in soils. But unfortunately, worldwide, we see, and a lot of literature says, any more than 20 part per million of boron levels in potato petioles is sufficient. It is sufficient that we don't see deficiencies. However, 20 is still deficient for overall potassium movement and yield and production in potato. We see increasing uptake of potassium and increased potassium levels in tissue once we get above 25, and then again greater than 30. Still seeing related boron deficiency symptoms in petioles even just under 30, and I'll show you a slide here in a few minutes. But this trial here suggests that any crop that has or is a heavy consumer of potassium, that our adequate levels, of potassium are likely to be closer to 60 or 80 parts per million. And we know from the crops that we work with that the potassium level needs to be, around 60 ppm to get the job done. Here you see some other research that supports that work, looking at boron applications and maintaining tissue levels at 30, 60, and 90 ppm in tissues. And the 60 ppm seems to be the adequate level for these different trials, giving us our best yield and our best potassium uptake. So when we look at potato production, we know where the optimum ranges need to be throughout the growing season for potassium. In early stages, we need to be starting someplace in that 10 to 13% range of potash and petiole. Then as we get to mid-ranges, it drops between 8 and 11%. And then to finish this crop, we need to maintain a potash level in petioles, greater than 6%. Obviously, 7% would be better during that bulking stage to give us the best yields and yield performance in this field. So we know that potatoes need adequate boron and K during bulking for yield and quality, where we have all kinds of related disorders. And again, adequate boron level stops that efflux or drop in potassium levels too quickly during that bulking stage. This is some field trials and some field work we've done here that kind of shows that in these particular fields. This first field here with our PMP program shows we start out at 12.98%, which is ideal for starting. We want to be as close to 13% potassium in the early stages. And then we want to see that gradual drop as we go to maturity and into bulking. And you can see here in August, late August, our bulking stage, we're still at the 7, almost 8% potassium in this crop. And then compared that to another field that never made it, We started out at 9%. There was some boron added to that because we were low in both boron and potassium. And we see a little bit of a swing, but then quickly the boron levels drop because the levels in the field were so low. You can see here this one. Ideally, we want to be over 30 ppm, and we pushed for that with foliar applications. But again, we're starting greater than 25 in this sand field, and that's okay, but still not perfect. You can see a drop here in potassium levels, and then you can see here as we respond again with more boron application, you see an upswing in potassium to over 13% for the short period of time. And then maintaining that level of boron in tissues greater than 25 and aiming for that greater than 30 helped us maintain potassium levels in those petioles right through into the bulking. Whereas this field here, where we started out low, even though we made an effort to bring boron levels up, it was short-lived. And again, that field never really did much. So we look at the relationship to sugar translocation throughout the plant and how this plant loads the phloem up with sucrose. Potassium and nitrates actually combine at the root surface and move up the xylem. The potassium breaks off from the nitrates to load the phloem with sucrose and move the sucrose down the phloem, down to the tuber, and unload it at the tuber for conversion to starches and carbohydrates. Now, it's important that that phloem's in good shape, and that's a function of boron. Without boron, the breakdown of the phloem restricts the flow of nutrients to the phloem, to the tuber, and again causes a yield reduction. So we look at that makeup here. Here is a xylem and phloem of a plant. You can see with boron how nice and organized that is, and without boron, this phloem's all dysfunctional, and just basically that conduit that the potassium needs to move that sucrose is disrupted. So anytime through the growing season that you have poor boron levels, this disruption of the phloem is going to restrict the movement of sucrose to the developing tubers, and you're going to lose yield. So it's important to keep our boron levels in tissue. I'm saying greater than 30 part per million, but our data suggests from the research we're looking at that should be around 60 part per million throughout the growing period, or you're losing valuable yields because of this constriction of the phloem. Again, just an electron microscope here of the same thing, showing an adequate phloem and xylem compared to a very dysfunctional, disorganized phloem. So we start relating that to yield and quality as well, and we look at sugar ends, something that's a real problem in potato production for chipping potatoes because of what happens in frying. So what happens here is we're getting high levels of reducing sugars and very low starch concentration in the potato at different stages. So any stress that reduces boron availability, reduces that adequate starch or sucrose flow to the tuber, has an impact on how these potatoes put down starch. You look at early season stress, low boron, low potassium availability in this potato here. We get high reducing sugar, low starches, and as that tuber develops, that never changes. So the reducing sugars stay low or stay high and elevated with low starch in that stem end of that potato. Same thing mid-season, we have the problem. We get lower starch concentration and higher reducing sugars in the middle of the tuber. And again, the blossom end, same sort of thing late in the season with stress, low boron and low potassium levels, and which equates to high reducing sugars and low starch. And that's what it looks like when we look at the frying piece of that differentiation. And the low starch and high reducing sugar doesn't change. Once the potato and stress relieve, again, we don't correct that problem. It maintains right through to maturity with that potato. So we always have that low starch and high reducing sugars in that part of the potato. And that's why when they fry, they fry with these darkened ends. So look at boron application. We want to put lots of boron in this crop, both on the ground and a foliar. I like to have some down on the ground because some movement up the xylem is going to give us better translocation across the guard cells from a foliar application and give us better mobility throughout the plant. So the combination of the two work very well together. When you look at a pound to a pound and a half the ground, and some of those soils are very low, the higher CEC, that might be 2 to 3 pounds on the ground. And then we follow that up with effective foliar applications. And I'm going to suggest no more than 1/4 to 1/3 of a pound per application because of possible phytotoxicity. And this is not just crop specific, it goes across different varieties of potatoes. So on the safe side, we don't want to go above 1/3 of a pound. We've seen damage in some of our trials of 1/2 of a pound. It causes yield loss. So we can put on as many times as we want if we're below that 60 ppm, but that 1/4 of a pound to 1/3 of a pound in one application of actual boron is kind of the safe way to go. This is a leaf sample taken in the field by me. It was one of our days, our potato days in PEI, where the crop looked fantastic. The growers were really happy and proud of what they had coming. And they challenged me to find a deficiency in this field. I took about 2 steps off the headland into the field and pulled this leaf. And unless you know what you're looking at here, this is boron deficiency, typical boron deficiency in a leaf, as you can see here by this leaf here. And when you look at that, when you have a deformed leaf like this, with more of the leaf on one side of the midrib than the other, that's because of boron deficiency and basically a death of cells here that the leaf is trying to grow around. We see that actual happening when you're less than 30 part per million in the petiole. I took these leaves back to the lab. This tissue sample come out at 27 ppm. So although, unless you're looking for this and know what you're looking for, very difficult to see, but there's yield loss happening here. That phloem is broken down, things aren't moving the way they should, and we're losing productivity in that crop. So a lot of the times we look at the crop we're growing in potatoes, 1/3 of the yields come from the tops at the end of the season and moving to sugars as this thing matures naturally. And we don't want to kill the crop because that just kills the crop and we don't get mobility of sugars to the tuber. But if we can help this crop senesce naturally and move those sugars from the tops to the developing tuber, when we have this rank green, we get this done. This is a field, this is just one of those experiments is by chance, where we applied a fungicide application that had boron in it, and you can see that we missed on this side of the field. And here you can see a couple of days after the application, you see the potatoes starting to turn and those sugars moving from the tops and this plant starting to senesce. And that was one single application of 1/4 pound of actual boron being applied to that field. Our trials have showed us with that one application late season to help to shut this crop down that we're getting anywhere from 5 to 20 hundredweight from that application. So an average around 10 to 12 if you look at it. This is other trials, and we've done many of these trials where you see a treated versus a checked. This is at 2 liters to the acre of Magtrac. You can see the difference here from 339 in a check to 414 in total weight. Another trial, 379 or 380 to 428. Here we're 312 to 342. So a significant impact in overall yield that's in the field that we would have left behind if we did not do that late season foliar application. Other trials, this is from Manitoba, over 2 years, showing that 2 liter application late in the season. And what I mean by 2 liters, that's 1 liter followed by a second liter 10 to 14 days later, starting a good 4 weeks before digging to get this thing to settle down. The other thing too is we don't have to go in and put a desiccant on this, or if we do, it's a very light treatment and a much better quality potato going into storage. But you can see here again, too, this equated to an average about 3,200 hundredweight across those fields in those 2 years. So look at the economics of that. 1 liter of Magtrac at $10 a liter. Oops. Increase average 12.5 hundredweight at the current price per hundredweight, less the application. That's $121 an acre more that we got on a field that would have been left behind. The 2 liter application with a 32 hundredweight increase, that equates to almost $317 an acre more that we would have left in that field if we let it die down or if we desiccated that crop prematurely. When we add to that whole program the potassium part of our yield and quality, this is the use of agro-potash in a couple of fields on top of a good boron program. So we've already got a 2 liter boron program or adequate boron program in this field, and then adding 2 liters of agro-potash towards the end of the year with that. And you can see here the check the check plots versus the treated, a substantial increase in both places with that additional agri-potash application. So basically an average of 11% increase over the check in that field. Another application here, looking at 2 liters on top of a good boron program. And again, we're seeing about 82 hundredweight per acre difference in these fields. So you look again at the economics from that agri-potash program on top of a good boron program. Again, you're looking at, in the first case, about an average of 40 hundredweight difference times the price of potatoes, less the cost of 2 liters of agri-potash, additional over $400 an acre return on top of what you were doing. The second trial, 82 hundredweight difference, equates to about $841 per acre from that agri-potash application. So the two work very well together. We oftentimes put the agri-potash and boron together at the end of the season, rather than here we have 2 programs on top of one another, but they work very well together. And the outcome, and this is trials after trials we've done for years with the growers that we work with that are following these programs and getting a lot of success from these programs. And the key is not just what we're doing. Agri-potash coming from a potassium carbonate, very good uptake, very easy on the plant, doesn't actually jug, gets into the plant. So every potash source is not going to do that. Agri-potash has a point of deliquescence of about 44, which makes it a very good source of potassium for uptake by the plant. And with that, I thank you.
Thanks, Greg. You know, I was saying to Jerome and Emma during Greg's presentation, it's funny, I've probably heard Greg speak 3 or 4 times throughout my career, and every time I'm able to pick up something new that I didn't hear before or learn before. You continuously learn with plant nutrition, right?
I really hope that someday I can have as much knowledge about crop nutrition as Greg does. Understanding all those interactions between the different characteristics of soil is so complex, but really important to helping us understand crop nutrition and how to better feed our potatoes.
Greg will be available later on for our Q&A session, along with all of our other speakers. So if you have a question for what you've heard so far, definitely pop it into that Q&A box and we'll be able to answer it later on.
So our next speaker today will address a very hot topic in the industry right now, fertilizer prices. We know that this topic is top of everyone's minds as they start to plan for their 2022 growing season. And while there is no easy answer, we've asked Bill Dunbar, the Vice President for Eastern Canada, to help clarify why prices have increased over the last few months and what we can expect going into this year's growing season.
Good. Donc, la prochaine présentation sera faite aujourd'hui par Bill Dunbar, qui est le vice-président pour l'Est du Canada. Donc, il va nous parler du sujet concernant le marché des fertilisants, qui est assez particulier pour cette année.
Before we hand it over to Bill, we have one last participation question for everyone today. We know there's a lot of talk about crop input prices, particularly nitrogen. So at this time, do you, as growers, plan to adjust your nitrogen rates in 2022? Yes, no, or I haven't decided yet?
I can definitely confirm that fertilizer pricing is at the top of mind for growers and retailers. We're doing our best we can to ensure the supply of our products here into Eastern Canada. There's a lot of work happening behind the scenes here to ensure that Yara can maintain our position as a reliable supplier and partner for our retailers and farmers.
Well, it looks like from the results of the poll that despite uncertainty, most growers recognize the importance of nitrogen to growing a successful potato crop. And with that, take it away, Bill.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you here today. I've been asked by the team to speak to you about a hot topic and one that many of you had requested that we include in our Top Potato session this year. And that is, what is going on in this fertilizer market? Why are prices changing and increasing so much? So I have to admit that I've worked in this fertilizer industry for 35 years. Since graduating from University of Guelph, I've worked in crop inputs and fertilizer my entire career. Today, I'm responsible for Yara for sales and marketing in Eastern Canada, and I'm also part of Yara's North American management team. There's lots of things that are impacting fertilizer prices. It's a supply and demand of commodities. There's forces that drive prices higher, and there's forces that drive it lower. Recently, there's been a number of forces driving fertilizer prices higher. And I'm going to get into some of those here in just a little bit, but just wanted to say that the price of natural gas is one of the significant ones. And I'm going to say geopolitics is another reason why we're seeing a lot of volatility and particularly upward price movement at this point in time. This chart here, or map rather, I'm showing you of the world is covered with a maze of arrows. That is where fertilizer is moving from one part of the world to another part of the world. And as you know, there's a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere, and we have different cropping seasons. So basically, every day, every week of the year, fertilizer is moving either in the north or the southern hemisphere and through this maze of movement from where product is produced and where it's consumed. Now, if I ask you guys, where is or who are the biggest consumers of fertilizer, and you'll probably come up with the answers. It's China, it's India, it's Brazil, and it's USA, or North America, we can say. So that's where it's being used. But what a lot of people maybe don't understand is where is the fertilizer produced? So if we look at production, on the left-hand side of this chart is ammonia and urea above each other. Those products are nitrogen products, and the biggest producers of those are China, Russia, and USA. So that's where the nitrogen is mainly produced. Then we look at phosphates in the center, that middle chart. The largest producers of phosphate globally are China, Morocco, that's North Africa. So there's quite a rich deposit of phosphates in North Africa that are being mined and distributed. And the USA, typically, mostly in Florida, is where most of that is mined. Then we get to potash, and finally Canada gets to show up. But Canada's the #1 producer of phosphates globally, or of potash globally, I should say, followed by Russia and Belarus. Recently, with Belarus, there's been a number of sanctions put against that country, and that is reducing the availability of potash coming out of Belarus because we're not allowed to do trade globally with Belarus. Here's a chart showing historical prices of urea from 2007 to 2021. And you'll see that there's 4 different lines, and these are price references used for urea globally. So one is the Baltic, so Russia, we have Egypt, we have the Middle East, and we have New Orleans that we're using as references. And you'll see these trends and these prices follow each other quite closely on this market because we truly are a global market. So what happens in one market is going to impact another market. What I really want to show you on this more than the prices is really what's happened with the volatility of prices and when we have seen price spikes earlier. So back in 2008, 2009, some of you may remember that there was a huge spike in the price of fertilizer. It was followed by a relatively steep decline, and then we've had some volatility since that time. But I would say for the last 4, 5, 6 years, fertilizer prices have been at relatively low values, providing good value. Recently, fertilizer prices have increased dramatically, especially for urea, but I'll show you the same for phosphates and potash. So this, again, is urea, but I've shortened this time frame up. So we're looking from January 2021 to January 2022. What I really want to show here in the early part of the year, fertilizer prices were at relatively good values, relatively low. Typically at the end of the planting season, so end of May, June, there's typically a lull in the fertilizer prices because nobody's planting, the demand's kind of gone, and it's a bit early to be buying for next year. But that didn't happen this year, and the reason being is that the crop prices have been good. Farmers used a lot of fertilizer this year, and North America had virtually no inventory at the retail network, at the wholesale network, or at the producer level. There really was just no urea in North America. So that kind of kept prices firm, and it actually increased a little bit. But then came August, and Hurricane Ida hit. So Ida hit the Gulf of Mexico, really impacting some big fertilizer-producing states, namely Louisiana and Texas. They both produce a lot of urea, ammonia, and UAN, and ammonium sulfate, I should add in there as well. That hit the market, and we lost at least a month's production. So 1/12 of the yearly production was lost. So that started to really drive prices a little bit higher. On the right behind that, India came along and said, we need to buy 2 million tons more of urea than we historically buy. Normally between the end of September and February, India would buy somewhere around 2.5 million tons. This year, suddenly, they need to buy 4.5 million tons in that same period because they were having some good monsoons, so they had plenty of moisture, crop yields looked good, and they needed nitrogen to fertilize those crops. Then, right behind that, natural gas prices in Europe skyrocketed. I'm going to show you another chart in a couple minutes around that impact and what that price increase has been. But that drove many plants in Europe to curtail production and therefore reducing the overall supply. And then right behind that, China announces they're not going to export urea from November 1 to May of 2022. Now, early on, I showed you that China is the largest producer of nitrogen globally. China has historically been a big exporter of urea, and a lot of their urea would go to India, and they would supply India. So here we have a situation that India needs 2 million more tons than they normally take, and their largest supplier, China, said, sorry, but we're not going to be exporting any urea. Therefore, that drove, all the Middle East and the Baltic to try and cover off and supply these Indian demands. And that just simply drove the price of nitrogen higher and higher. Now, I said I would talk a wee bit about natural gas, and this is a good visual. We're looking at the price of natural gas per unit in US dollars. First, want to focus your attention on the bottom line. So that green line in the bottom is the Henry Hub, which is the North American kind of gas reference price. And it's been trading somewhere between $4 and $5 since 2018 till today, so a very consistent price. Europe, on the other hand, the TTF, the price of natural gas there has kind of traded between 10 and got down to 3.50 here a year and a half ago. Suddenly, huge increases. So in the matter of a little over a year, the prices went up almost 10 times the price. For those that don't know, a lot of energy, so natural gas, is required to make fertilizers. So to take the nitrogen from the air that we breathe and turn it into a solid to make fertilizer that we can spread or spray onto crops takes a lot of energy to do that. What happens with these high prices is fertilizer producers are not able to break even with these high costs. So many companies in Europe had to stop producing nitrogen fertilizers, Yara included. We have a number of plants in Europe. We curtailed about 40% of our production for a number of weeks and continue to do that yet today. Even looking at the dotted lines following today's numbers, the prices are still going to are projected to stay high based on the futures market right through, the rest of this year. So we're not going to see a big drop in prices at this time. Now, I do want to declare, I'm recording this, and today is mid-January. For us today, for our event here, it's February 16th. So some things may have changed and we may have an update, but that's the situation as of today. I said I would talk a little bit about phosphates. If you look at this phosphate chart, very, very similar to what we saw with nitrogen. We had this steep increase in the early 2008-2009 period with a sharp decline and then volatility through the next number of years. And with the last 4 or 5 years, relatively low values, but then this sudden run up in phosphate prices here in 2021, late 2021 and early 2022. Just want to give you an indication of supply and demand. So here's been the demand for phosphates. Phosphate demand has increased from something around 58 million tons in 2010. We're going to be somewhere around 75 million tons projected in 2022. So that's a significant increase in demand. And we know as demand goes up, typically price goes up if supply cannot keep up. Now I bring up the potash chart. Again, very similar to what we saw with nitrogen, phosphates, and potash. This trend where the last 4 or 5 years we've had some relatively low values with a sudden late 2021, 2022 rapid increase in prices of potash. And the same as with phosphates, we have been seeing globally an increase in demand for potash. And you may wonder why this increase, but we have to think, world populations are growing. We're trying to have more third world countries have access to more food, and we just need more food. The other thing that's happening is crop yields, especially corn, have increased dramatically. In the last couple of decades, we've almost doubled the yields in corn here in Canada. So that's taking a lot more nutrient out of the soil. Therefore, we need to replenish the soil as well. So global demand of all nitrogen, phosphate, and potash are all increasing at this time. So just to wrap up, just a few things. I just want to look back at a couple of things because we talked about crop prices. And you'll notice that crop prices, and this is corn, wheat, soybeans, and cotton. So potatoes are not on here, and I apologize for that. I could not find that information. But these main crops are probably the ones that are really driving fertilizer demand. A very similar trend to what the fertilizer was. And why? Well, as crop prices are higher, farmers typically will put on more fertilizer to get higher yields because we know fertilizer will increase yields, especially in countries where they're probably under-fertilizing and where farmers do not have enough money to fertilize the way they probably should. So that's also driving this demand for fertilizer is because of these crop prices. Now I've overlaid the N, P, and K charts here, and this is North American references, but you'll see that they pretty much follow each other. As nitrogen goes up, phosphate and potash goes up, and vice versa. So that trend is very, very similar, which is also very similar to the previous slide, which is the crop prices overlaid on top of this. Now, economists would say that, the cure for high prices for commodity products is high prices, and the cure for low prices is low prices. And I think we've seen that over and over again. Other people say, what goes up must come down, and we see this balance. And I would say over my 35 years in this business, we've seen this. I've seen it back in early 1990 with the first Gulf War. There was this huge spike in fertilizer prices as well, which stayed with us for a couple of years. So in the early 90s, we had a spike in fertilizer prices. Then we had a decline. 2008, 2009, we had this spike of fertilizers and then a decline. 2021, 2022, we have this spike in fertilizers. The only question that's kind of in my mind is when will it change? Is it going to be a higher price? Is it going to be a lower price? And by how much? I think those are the things that we really want to try and understand. But for this season, the way things appear, we are going to have substantially higher fertilizer prices than we had in 2021. So just to wrap up, I want to let you know that I will be back at the end of this event for a panel discussion, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you guys may have.
Well, I think I speak for everyone that that was really informative. We cannot change the circumstances of the current market, and hopefully this helps shed some light on understanding why we are experiencing what we are in the market. Since Bill has recorded this, it's been a couple of weeks, and geopolitics has continued to really change the market and affect the volatility in pricing.
You know, it's really hard to understand the entire global picture, so a really big thanks to Bill for helping us understand that. You know, I'm really glad it's his job and not mine to keep track of all of this.
Me too. This will definitely help me explain to my customers and growers as well what's happening in the market and give some kind of shed some light on it, right? Thankfully our Yara Leva and our Yara Vita product has all been ordered for the growing season, so we shouldn't see any issues with supply with those products.
That's really good. We now have a couple of testimonial videos from growers who've been using our products in Eastern Canada for several years.
It's a very positive experience. Yara is very open to any ideas that we have. They want to work with us and help us grow better and bigger yields. You know, like I say, they've got open ears to what we need to try and do a better job.
My name is Ryan Albright, President and CEO of Albright Farms Limited and Covered Bridge Potato Chip Company. We grow approximately 400 acres of potatoes and rotate that with oats. We use Proco on our farm, and what we like about it is instead of adding our nutrients into our fertilizer blend with granular and risking not getting uptake to every plant, the Proco spreads the micronutrients across all of the fertilizer blend, so we can be assured that every plant gets all the micronutrients that it needs. We used to use gypsum in trials, but we never really saw much of a difference between using gypsum and not. And then when we started using the calcium nitrate, the first year we saw a major difference. So now we use it across all of our products. We've found a better skin set, better quality, and in turn it helps us at our potato chip factory to put out a better quality potato chip product. Approximately maybe 10 years ago, Emerson McMillan and I started some test trials with our liquid program with Yara, and we saw really good results. And from there we slowly built the program, and now we continually use it across all of our acres, the full program. We like it because we're able to monitor where the PDLs are at as far as magnesium, nitrogen, and then we can adjust week over week to ensure that the plant has enough to carry it through, especially a dry season like we had last summer. So when we look at our own farm operation, we've done cost analysis on the program. We've always do checks, so we ensure that we're getting the value out of the products that we use. And year over year, our checks always show that besides paying for the product itself that we put on our potatoes, it also gives us a return on our investment. The main reason we started working with Yara was because we could see a need for the importance of a better fertility program. The price of land has been increasing year over year. Equipment, overhead, everything's very expensive. So on a per acre basis, we needed to get better return, more yield. And that's when we really started to experiment with Yara products in our fertility and rotation. So instead of growing X amount of acres, we've been able to reduce that and still have the same amount of potatoes harvested at the end of the year with less acres.
Robert and Ryan are many of growers that we work with across Eastern Canada, and it's with growers, the help of growers like them, that we rely on them to build robust top potato programs through trialing products, just like kind of Ryan had described there earlier.
Last on our agenda today, we have Taylor Jeffrey, our sales agronomist in Ontario, who's going to review the trial results from our team's work in the field this past season. All of these trials were done with grower partners, just like Robert and Ryan.
Donc, notre dernier conférencier aujourd'hui Ça va être Taylor Jeffrey, qui est agronome de territoire en Ontario. Donc, il va venir nous parler des derniers essais qui ont été faits dans la dernière saison. Et tous ces essais-là, ils ont été faits avec des producteurs, dans le fond, comme Robert puis Ryan, dont on vient de voir là, les témoignages.
And it's all you, Taylor.
My name is Taylor Jeffrey. I'm the sales agronomist for Ontario, and I'm here today to talk about some of our 2021 trial data and look at the last couple of years of data as well. Now, before I go into the individual trials that we ran this year, I thought it might be interesting just to look at some, from a very high level, some of the trends that we've seen just this year and looking back at the last couple of years as well. So if you look only at 2021, across Eastern Canada, Yara ran 47 different field trials. And if you average the yield response from the Yara products against everything else that was tested across those 47 trials, on average, the yield response was 9.84 hundredweight per acre just from using Yara products. And then I took another step back and I looked at all the data from 2015 all the way up to 2021. And in this case, that's over 200 different field trials, and that average response was 22 hundredweight per acre just from applying Yara products to potato crops. And this incorporates our Yara Vita Procoat line, our Yara Leva calcium nitrate products, as well as our Yara Vita foliar products as well. And this really just shows the commitment that Yara has to conducting these field trials, specifically within the Eastern Canadian team, and their commitment to sharing this data with farmers, with our retail partners, to try to help farmers grow the best crops that we possibly can. So the way I've structured some of the presentation today is to just move sort of through a plant's life cycle. So we're going to start from the pre-plant, before the plants are in the ground, all the way up to the end of the season at tuber bulking into maturity. So the first product that we're going to run into there is then our Yara Vita Procoat. So those of you who aren't familiar, Yara Vita Procoat is a oil-based micronutrient suspension that gets applied to dry fertilizer blends. And what it does is it coats every single granule with a micronutrient suspension, and then each one of those granules becomes a feeding site and supplies micronutrients, which greatly increases the distribution of those micronutrients across the field. You may have seen this data before, because it was presented last year, and in this case we looked at no micronutrients compared against using a dry blend, where we saw a 27 hundredweight advantage. But when we applied those micronutrients using Procoat and we saw that increased dispersion, we actually went up another 8 hundredweight compared against the dry micro blend. Now, those trials from last year specifically were looking at Procoat boron and Procoat zinc, but there are other forms of Procoat. So this year we decided to focus in a little bit more, and we tried to look at two products that are a little bit less frequently used. So one was Procoat Manganese, and the other one was Proco Copper, which is not new, a new product in general, but it is new to the Eastern Canadian team. So I'm going to go through both of those different trials, or different data sets, and we'll start first with Proco Copper. So Proco Copper is a 31.3% copper suspension, and it delivers 500 grams per liter of copper. In this case, we ran this trial on 8 different sites, all in 2021, on the varieties Caribou, Russet, Highland, Red Norlands, and Pomerelle. And in this case, where we applied Proco Copper, we actually saw a yield advantage of 24 hundredweight on average across all 8 sites. So this is something we're very interested in and we're very excited to see, and we're going to continue to research this in the future. And then we also ran some trials on Procoat Manganese. So Procoat Manganese is 29% manganese, and it delivers, once again, 500 grams per liter of manganese. We had 3 sites. This was done in 2020 as well as 2021 on the varieties Caribou, Eva, and Goldrush. In this case, we saw an even greater yield advantage of 3,500 weight per acre, where we applied Procoat Manganese. So once again, this is something we're going to continue to look into in the future, but the results today are very promising. So that's sort of our pre-plant and planter program. Now we'll look more at our Yara Leva calcium nitrates. So these are best applied. They can be applied pre-plant. They can be applied at hilling as well. And in this case, we've got two different products: Yara Leva Tropicoat as well as Yara Leva Nitrobor. So TopPotato is a 15.5% nitrogen, where 14.5 of that is coming from nitrate, and also a 19% calcium, all on a single granule. Nitrobor is very similar, slightly less nitrogen, a little bit less calcium, but we also have the addition of 0.3% boron to each granule as well. Now, supplying the nitrogen in that nitrate form is the optimal form of nitrogen to be applied. It's the preferred nitrogen source for plants, and the calcium source is extremely soluble, and increased calcium levels in plants has been linked to resistance to abiotic stresses like droughts and heat waves, as well as biotic stresses like pests and some diseases. So we'll look first at our TopPotato data. So this is data from 2017 all the way up to 2021, 15 different varieties across 45 different sites. In this case, when we take all of those trials and average the results, we see a 2,300 weight advantage wherever we apply Yara TopPotato. And the story is very similar when it comes to Yara Nitrobor. In this case, we had 53 different sites from 2017 to 2021, 15 different varieties, and the results were 2,400 weight advantage wherever we applied Yara Nitrobor. And these are very consistent results. We see these typical, this is the typical result whenever we introduce Yara calcium nitrates to a farmer's program who isn't using them already. You usually see a 20 to 2,500 weight advantage wherever we apply it. So that kind of covers off our pre-plant and all the way up to hilling, but after hilling we also have some more that we can do to help manage our crops. So this is our Yara foliar fertilizers. Now we do have quite a lineup of a bunch of different elements and different combinations, but in this case we're going to narrow it down. We're just going to look at AgriPotash and Yara Bortrac. So the image here on the left is where boron was supplied to the plant. And you can see in this case the phloem is very well organized, which leads to optimal movement of sugars and nutrients through the plant. And where we don't supply boron, we can actually see quite a disordered phloem system, which will resist the movement of sugars and nutrients throughout the plant. So in this case, we had 5 different sites this year looking just in 2021. The varieties that we used were Russet, Dakota, Shepherdy, and 2137. And on average, the yield response where we applied Yara Bortrac and where we applied Yara AgriPotash was 2,900 weight per acre. So again, this is something we're very interested in. We're looking more and more into multiple applications of boron throughout the season rather than one large application towards the end, and also looking at mixing in multiple applications of potassium, again specifically towards the end of the season, but we think there could be some data for earlier as well. Now, just before I sort of finish things off here, I'm going to just review 2 products that we have that are relatively new for the 2022 growing season. And what we're looking for is partners who are willing to do some trials with us this year, replicated trials where we have a protocol established to get some good data from across Eastern Canada. The first one is Yara Magtrac CMZ. This is high magnesium with copper, manganese, and zinc. It's a liquid formulation, it's widely tank mixable, and it's a great product to be applied early in the season to help promote vegetative growth before the plants begin setting tubers. And then the other product that we're looking for trial partners on is Yara TopPotato JC. So this is a polymer-coated version of our Yara TopPotato. The advantage of having the polymer coating is it allows us to mix it with other fertilizers, so we can apply it pre-plant blended with other products, but we may also be able to apply it through the planter as well. It also allows us, depending on how much of that coating we put on, to control the release of that nitrogen throughout the season. It's still a nitrate product, and it can be applied all the way from pre-plant all the way up to hilling. And I do have one image from a small trial we ran this year on TopPotato JC. So the left side of that image is the north end of the field where the TopPotato JC was applied. The south end was the grower standard program, and you can see having that increased nitrate, but specifically the calcium, the soluble calcium being available, has made these plants much darker. They were a lot healthier, especially during this time, which was a period of really high heat, and quite a bit of drought was going on at the time as well. So with that, I'll hand it back to Emmeline and Lucas, and hope everybody has a safe and healthy 2022 planting season. Thanks.
The trial results from our Yara Leva calcium nitrate, and Yara Vita foliar products never ceases to amaze me. From Taylor's presentation, we can see that once again, both of these products are really contributing to a lot more potatoes.
It's really exciting to see these results year after year. I really like how Taylor laid out his presentation, showing the range of tools we have for the whole season, all the way from planting to harvest. And while we have really strong yield data, I'm especially excited about some of the storage trials that we have going on this year. We have really great information about how to get a high yielding crop, and we're trying to build our database on how we not only produce high yield, but high quality and a crop that stores better. We currently have some trials in storage, and we will be evaluating them next month and look forward to being able to share those results with you.
It's great to see Yara is continuing to introduce innovative products, like as we talked earlier, our Magtrac CMZ. We're excited to see the performance of Magtrac CMZ in this season and what it can bring for us going forward.
Wow, it looks like we've had some questions coming in throughout the webinar, and I'd like to now bring back Marcus, Brian, Greg, and Bill to answer some of those questions. And while they rejoin, we have had Lucas, I have a question to get you started. After hearing both Marcus and Greg's talks about micronutrients, I think it's important to mention the value of in-season tissue sampling to understand where your micronutrients are throughout the season. If a grower's interested in starting tissue sampling, how do you recommend they get started?
Yeah, so I want to say it's pretty simple, but really what it comes down to is kind of the first thing. We want to have about an 8 to 10 inch plant to start with. We want to be measuring what they're picking up in the soil, not off of the seed piece. And then second step would be taking that third and fourth petiole from the top. And then also kind of that fourth step is really every 7 to 10 days or 4 to 6 times throughout the season to really monitor how those nutrients are moving throughout the season so that we can address them by applications of Yara Vita throughout. And the other thing to mention too is where A&L Labs there in London is a great partner for sending those to for accurate results and timely turnaround on the tissues too. So.
Great, thank you. Well, Bill, our first question today is for you. It looks like we've had a bunch of questions coming in about the fertilizer market. Instead of answering each one of those individually, are there any updates that you can give us since this presentation was recorded a few weeks ago?
Yeah, there sure is. And like I said in the presentation, these products are all commodities, so prices do move up and down and different factors always come about. But yeah, there have been some both up and down actually. So if we look at nitrogen, nitrogen kind of peaked at that late December, kind of early January timeframe. Since then, we have seen some declines. India has bought a big chunk of fertilizer and now is kind of pulling out for a little while before they buy some more. So that's put a bit of downward pressure on urea. But the challenge for us here in Eastern Canada a little bit right now is just the timing. It's getting almost too late to be able to buy nitrogen and actually get vessels organized and get it here in time for spring. So that's a little bit on the nitrogen market. Phosphates, on the other hand, have actually increased a little bit more since that end of December timeframe. So phosphates have gone up globally, somewhere, I don't know, $40, $50 a ton maybe have gone up since that time. So expected that's going to stay fairly strong here through the season. And then potash, some of you may see some of these things on Twitter and different things as well, but Canpotex, which is the Canadian potash exporters, they've just finalized their big sales that they do to India and China, who are the largest potash purchasers. They just finalized those at basically levels that are at today's market. So kind of with that in mind, I don't expect to see much change in potash prices kind of going forward till the end of this year. So that's as of today anyway.
Great, thanks for that update. Marcus, there seems to be a lot of interest in the Magtrac CMZ product that we've spoken about this whole webinar. One of the questions that's come in is, when would you choose to use a product like Magtrac CMZ that has multiple micronutrients versus just individual applications of individual micronutrients?
Yeah, no, good question. I guess I think it's important to say at the outset, this doesn't necessarily have to be a binary type decision, right? It doesn't have to be a combination or a single nutrient. As we look at the need for season-long crop nutrition, I think there's definitely opportunity for both. probably where I would steer more towards a single nutrient approach. And again, I think we always want to make sure that we're deferring to the local expertise and we're leveraging insight that's coming from field, from soil tests and tissue tests, et cetera. But anytime I would probably gravitate towards a single product is where we can say categorically we are going to have a problem with a particular nutrient, right? Like my boron levels are extremely deficient, or I'm seeing those deficiencies show up in tissue. And I think then it's definitely warranted to move with a single nutrient approach. But where I think kind of a multi-nutrient approach kind of fits in is when we really look at the fact that all of these nutrients function together. It's not about a single nutrient if we're outside of that categorical kind of deficiency type range, right? Once we get kind of more into this hidden hunger type mode, I think this is where probably the multi-nutrient approach becomes a little bit more practical, right? We know some things about the likelihood of particular nutrients being low, and I think proactively kind of plugging them in kind of a combination and taking advantage of the synergy of those nutrients makes a ton of sense. But I think more than anything, I would be hesitant to just categorically say it's an either or approach. I think there's definitely opportunities to increase productivity and drive grower profitability when we start to look at the entire portfolio of Yara Vita and overlay that with the nutrient needs that we begin to see on a field by field level based on the analytical data that we have at our fingertips.
No, and I think that makes great sense, Marcus. That's why we created a product like Magtrac CMZ is the first application, get us out of the door. We know we need those nutrients, and then let's analyze through tissue samples throughout the season, right? So that's great. Exactly. Appreciate the answer. Yeah. There's also a good amount of questions coming in regarding carbon, a lot of different ones, so it's really hard to answer all of them. But I think, Brian, just to try and summarize them into a bit more for you, most are asking about what are some easy steps or first steps that a potato grower obviously can do or initiate on their farm to reduce carbon, or things to consider around that topic.
All right. Well, good morning. I don't know that there's any easy solution here, but I think what you can look at is you have to basically start with an accounting of your greenhouse gas emissions on your farm and figure out what are your sources of emissions. So you really have to dig into what are you doing and what are those sources, and then figure out what you can do to hopefully decrease and eliminate some of those emissions. And maybe the easy part is you tackle the easy ones first and then look at the harder ones. Unfortunately, the harder ones might be the ones that have the highest impact on your farm. So for example, if it's fuel consumption, is it your tillage? Is it nitrogen use? You basically have to go in and establish your baseline and then systematically work to reduce those emissions. So think of biodiesel, using biodiesel instead of diesel. Think of reduced tillage instead of intensive tillage. Use a nitrate-based fertilizer like Tropicoat versus ammonium-based fertilizer like urea. And then I like to think about precision ag and how you can precisely put your fertilizer on to maximize nutrient use efficiency, have less losses to off-site in the form of gases or in leaching or movement off-farm. So I think if you take a system approach to your farm, take a look at everything that you're doing, and then systematically go about trying to reduce those losses, then I think you're on the right step. And there's no silver bullet here. I think it's a whole system approach to your farm, and I think there's lots that we can help with, and yeah, I think it's a good opportunity for everyone.
Oh, that's great. I know, Brian, you probably could have taken the whole 2 hours to chat with us about this topic, and it's hard, yeah, to summarize that all into one. But I think it's great that we're at least sharing some of this information with our growers and retail partners, right, to kind of get more of a discussion around it, exactly what we're doing today.
Yeah, so. And based on the survey results, it looks like a lot of the growers out there are also starting to think about that. So yeah. Off to a really great start. Mm-hmm. Well, we are approaching the top of the hour, so unfortunately that's all the time that we have today to answer questions. Please stay tuned for a follow-up email that will include not only the recording of the event, but the winner of the Traeger Grill that we spoke about at the beginning of our event today. So thank you all for sticking around towards the end. I want to thank all of the speakers who were willing to help us pre-record and also be available today for the question and answer session. And we hope to be able to see everyone next year at an in-person Top Potato event. So stay tuned for that announcement later in the year.
Et donc, c'est malheureusement tout le temps qu'on avait pour les questions. Par contre, ne vous inquiétez pas, si vous avez posé des questions qui sont restées irrépondues, nous vous contacterons et pour faire un suivi avec vous là, très prochainement. Et depuis, le tout a été enregistré, donc prochainement vous recevrez un autre email vous donnant le lien pour accéder aux présentations et également pour savoir qui est l'heureux gagnant du grill. Et n'hésitez pas là, à nous contacter pour tout commentaire ou encore d'autres questions. Ça va être avec un plaisir que nous allons y répondre. Donc, merci beaucoup. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your support and cooperation during the 2021 season. And I also want to thank Emmeline and Jerome here joining me today to host this event. It was great doing it with you guys. And we look forward to the 2022 season. Everyone have a safe and happy 22 season.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you guys.
Top Potato represents Yara's commitment to helping farmers grow their top crop in terms of yield and quality, having an impact on their profitability. Our knowledge, digital tools, and comprehensive crop nutrition portfolio on the market make up the core of Yara's crop nutrition solution for potatoes. Yara, knowledge grows.